and an MA in Comparative Studies. He graduated from Claremont Graduate University with a PhD in the History of Christianity in 2013, and currently teaches at BYU in the Religion Department. He and his wife Julie live in Spanish Fork with their 3 children, Miranda, Samuel, and Christopher. Let's welcome Brother Frederick.
Well, thank you, everyone. Appreciate you coming out and supporting the Sperry Symposium on a late Friday night. My topic is Peter and the Apocryphal tradition. Interesting topic. I teach primarily Religion 212 here at BYU, which is the second half of the New Testament, from Acts through Revelation. And one of the questions that always arises, usually about 6 weeks into the semester after we spend a couple weeks on Paul, I'll have a student who will say, well, where's Peter? Why don't we have more from Peter? We have all these letters from Paul, but we have just 2 short letters from Peter, and they're very nondescript. It's very hard to get a feel for Peter from those 2 letters. And in addition, you have this, this incident in Galatians chapter 2, where Paul talks about an encounter that he has with Peter, and Peter doesn't come off looking very good. Paul says that Peter wasn't eating with the Gentiles, and he kind of gave into peer pressure and goes over and sits with the Jews. And Paul says, I had to stand up and I called him a hypocrite in front of everybody. And that's kind of the last really historical piece we have on Peter. And so students are like, where's Peter in the early church? I thought he was the prophet, he was Jesus' successor, where is he? And so one of the things I usually refer to is I'll say, well, yeah, we have 1st and 2nd Peter, but you see a lot of Peter in the Apocryphal tradition. In the documents outside the New Testament is really where you get, where you really get to understand who Peter is and how he was viewed in the church. And so what I'll do tonight is I'll talk for a few minutes. I'll go over some of the documents where Peter plays a role, talk about those, talk about some ways of interpreting them, and then I'll end after about 35, 40 minutes or so and take any questions you guys have if there's anything you want to dig into further. So just a quick note here on terminology, because apocryphal, what does that mean? So there is the technical term, the Apocrypha, that we use for kind of the Jewish texts that didn't make it into the Protestant canon. So works like First Maccabees or Susanna, that kind of deal with that period between Ezra and the Gospel of Matthew. So what the Catholics kind of consider canonical, Eastern Orthodox consider canonical. Protestants, though, don't really do a whole lot with them. And so Latter-day Saints, we don't do much with them either. DNC 91, Joseph is doing his translation of the Bible, and he gets to the Apocrypha and says, what should I do with this? And the Lord says, well, some of it's good, but some of it's not so good. And so Joseph's just going to leave it alone. But that's what we would call the capital A Apocrypha. When we talk about New Testament Apocrypha, kind of use little a, which simply means kind of documents of dubious authenticity. We don't really know a lot about where these texts are from. They're not considered canon. Okay? The early church gauged them, they measured them, they investigated them, and they were kind of left off to the side as not divine. And so we can read them, we can research them, we can look for glimpses of Peter, but we have to do so with care. So that's kind of what we mean by apocryphal. There's also another category, a pseudepigrapha, that refers primarily to Old Testament books that didn't make it into the canon, that were ascribed to biblical authors, but were usually penned by someone else. And I think that's actually a better way of understanding what we're dealing with tonight. When we talk about Peter in the apocryphal tradition, we're talking about how Peter was viewed by those who may have written documents in his name, okay, talking about him as if it was Peter, but likely written by someone else, and very often agenda-driven. So these are examples of texts that you would find coming out in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries of the Christian church that are either ascribed to Peter. So for example, there's a Gospel of Peter, it's rather short. An Acts of Peter, which tells all about the adventures that Peter goes through. A letter of Peter to Philip, an Apocalypse of Peter. So those texts primarily dealing with Peter, but then other texts where Peter appears kind of as a 2nd or 3rd party, a Gospel of Mary, for example, Gospel of Thomas. Some documents known as the Pseudo-Clementines, the Apocrypha of James. And some of these we'll talk about. But Peter plays a much more prominent role outside the canon of the New Testament than he does in the second half of the New Testament. One of the things that I try to point out to my students is that just because we see a text like the Acts of Peter, just because it has Peter's name, does not necessarily mean that we can use it as a gauge to understand who Peter is. So in the spirit of Halloween, here you have a girl dressed up as Belle from Beauty and the Beast. How do we know she's Belle? Well, the dress that she's wearing is Belle's dress, the crown. There's things that are part of her persona that we would look at and say, well, she's pretending to be, or she's dressed up as Belle. But she's not actually Belle. No one would mistake this girl for the actual princess in Beauty and the Beast. Well, it is the same with Peter. Okay? So take a story like this. What you have here is a story from a text called the Acts of Peter, where Peter goes to Rome and he kind of squares off in this magical duel with his kind of adversary in all the Peter tradition, a guy by the name of Simon Magus. And so they're kind of trying to one-up each other on all these accomplishments. And Simon kills a guy and Peter raises him from the dead. And then Simon starts flying around the forum. And so Peter kind of casts a spell on him and prays to God to have Simon fall down and break his leg in 3 places. And then that's what happens. And then Simon is killed by the crowd and stoned to death. And Peter wins the day. Okay, well, it's a guy named Peter who's called Peter, and he's described like the Peter in the New Testament. Okay, but just because he looks and acts and talks like Peter does not necessarily mean we can correlate him with this Peter over here. Okay, here we have the same 2 characters, Peter and Simon, from Acts chapter 8, where Simon is from Samaria tries to buy the priesthood. Okay, we can look at that and say, that's actually Peter. We can read Acts 8 and say, that tells us something about Peter. Just because it's the same people over here does not mean that we can take this account and say, well, that's Peter as well. Okay, it may look like Peter, may act like Peter, may talk like Peter, but it doesn't mean it's Peter. Okay, and that's important to remember when kind of going through these New Testament documents. Okay, we have to kind of look at them. If they tell us something about how Peter's viewed, but if you go through them looking for historical or biographical information, you're just not going to find it. Okay? Or if you do, there's just no way to sift through the historical Peter from kind of the mythical magician. So just to kind of show you what I'm talking about, and here you have 2 texts attributed to Peter, both of which are called an apocalypse, or a vision of Peter. The one right here says, on the day of the decision of the judgment of God, all the children of men from the east unto the west shall be gathered before my Father who ever liveth, and he will command hell to open its bars of steel, and to give up all that is in it. And the beasts and the fowls shall he command to give back all flesh that they have devoured, since he desires that men should appear again. For nothing perishes for God, and nothing is impossible with him, since all days are his. So here in this apocalypse of Peter, it's kind of like the apocalypse of John, except in the apocalypse of John, John goes to heaven. In the apocalypse of Peter, Peter takes a tour of hell. And he's kind of like a proto-Dante figure. And one of the things he witnesses is men who were resurrected, and it says very specifically they're given their physical bodies back. The physical body, the value on the physical body, is a very important part of this apocalypse of Peter. Now compare it to this one over here on the far side. Again, also called Apocalypse of Peter, but it's primarily a dialogue, a resurrection dialogue between Jesus and Peter. And it says, he, meaning Jesus, said to me, be strong, for you're the one to whom these mysteries have been given. To know them through revelation, that he whom they crucified is the firstborn, and the home of demons, and the stony vessel in which they dwell, the Elohim of the cross which is under the law. But he who stands near him is the living Savior, the first in him whom they seized and released, who stands joyfully looking at those bid in violence, while they are divided amongst themselves. Now here's where things kind of take a turn. Therefore he laughs at their lack of perception, knowing that they are born blind. So then the one susceptible to suffering shall come, since the body is the substitute. For what they released was my incorporeal body, that I am intellectual spirit filled with radiant mind. So what you have here is Jesus talking and reflecting back upon the crucifixion, and essentially saying that those who crucified him were ignorant, because they crucified his body, but his body doesn't matter. What really matters to this Jesus is his spirit. And so on one hand, the physical body has great value. It's what you're going to get in the resurrection. On the other hand, it's very much kind of an anti-physical body stance. Both of which are attributed to Peter, okay, but very much opposing viewpoints. And so as I said, it's very difficult to look at these and say, okay, that's what Peter, the chief apostle, president of the church, believed. And what we get are different Christian groups producing literature using the name of Peter to promote an agenda. Whether that agenda is physical body is good, or very often you'll see the idea that the physical body is somehow bad. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. All right, so 6 documents I'm going to talk about specifically. Right? Each one of them presents Peter in a different persona or a different guise. So Pseudo-Clementines, where you see Peter as really the champion of the Orthodox Church. He is the guy. He's a superhero. He's a champ. The second one were the acts of Peter. The one I referenced earlier were kind of this magical Peter dueling with Simon Magus. A little bit different text. Third, the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Mary, where we see a vastly different Peter. This time kind of Peter as antagonist. Fifth one was called the Apocrypha of James, where Peter is used to as kind of stand in for ignorant Christians, those who don't understand the real truth, real knowledge, are kind of personified through Peter. Then finally, the Gospel of Peter, okay, which is a remarkable text in that Peter's name only appears in there once, but it says a lot about him where it does appear in the text and what that's in the text. All right, everyone hear me okay? I don't know if I'm close to the microphone. Any problems with that? All right, so the text known as the Pseudo-Clementines, we're dealing with most of these texts 2nd to 4th century. Is usually a pretty good date for these. Anything after the 4th century, it usually has very little value at all, just as far as telling us anything about the church. Significantly, it's part of a larger corpus of literature attributed to Clement, who is, tradition says, the 4th bishop of Rome. Okay, Peter being the 1st, so Clement would be the 4th pope. Okay, it pops up in the New Testament a couple times, kind of just off the side. Paul will talk about Clement. Clement himself, there's 2 letters of Clement that appear very early on in the Christian church, 1st century. This is a very important figure. Okay, we don't talk about him much, but there's a lot of significance and value to Clement. The significance of this document is that Peter stands in for the Orthodox tradition, kind of the emerging Catholic Church, who wants to explain or define, elaborate on how Clement gets his authority. Why should we listen to Clement? And why should we take this guy seriously? Well, this text is going to link Clement to Peter, and then Clement is going to be kind of prophet by association, through his association with Peter. So Peter, of course, is going to be built up as this remarkable figure, so that Clement's association with Peter lends Clement a great deal of validity. And so I'll focus just on 3 aspects of this really quickly. This is a huge, rather lengthy document. Okay, I'm just going to pick 3 things to talk about quickly. First, we're going to see Peter as preserver of truth. Okay, so there then Peter entered, and when he had looked on the multitude, every eye in which was fixed upon him in breathless stillness. And there's on the magician Simon, there's Peter's kind of arch nemesis again, who stood in the midst, he began to discourse as follows. Peace be with you all who are ready to commit yourselves to the truth of God. This is great and incomparable gift to our world. He has sent us, the true prophet of good principle, has commissioned us by way of salutation before any instruction to speak to you of this truth. So Clement talks about how as a boy he's searching for truth. And he goes to philosophy and he can't find truth there. And then he hears from Barnabas, okay, from the book of Acts. Barnabas shows up in his town and tells him about this guy named Peter who's announcing this wonderful message about the Son of God. And Clement says, I need to go find this guy. And this is his encounter with Peter. Okay? And Peter says, I've got the truth. You can trust me. You can take my word for it. And the second thing you see is Peter standing up kind of in the face of opposition. So Simon gets up and tries to say, you shouldn't listen to Peter. He's a magician. He's going to show you tricks, but there's no truth to it. And Peter takes this in stride, and Peter, with a smile and an impressive directness, spoke the words, Ye men, I admit that, God willing, I am capable of doing what these men here say, and in addition am ready, if you will not hear my words, to turn your whole city upside down. And so Peter says, I have power, I have authority. Simon's right. I can do things. Okay? But what I'm here to do is to show you the truth. So Peter here does not back down, okay, from opposition. And then finally, and this is perhaps the largest point to the Pseudo-Clementine literature, is that Peter is authorized by God. He has authority which he is then going to pass on to Clement. So as Peter's about to leave Caesarea, Simon has fled off to Rome, and Peter's going to go track him down and catch him. Peter says, "Since now someone must be appointed to fill my place, let us all with one accord pray God to make known the ablest among us, who may set himself in the chair of Christ and lead his church in the spirit of godliness." After these words, he laid his hand upon Zacchaeus and said, "Ruler and Lord of all, Father and God, guard thou the shepherd with the flock." Then the Pseudo-Clementines end with him doing the same with Clement, okay, putting his hand on his head and kind of ordaining him as an overseer, a bishop in the church. So the point of this literature is to show you how Clement gets his authority. But Peter is the one who gives it to him. And it's this. And I like to think if there's any Peter in these documents we're going to discuss that is close to the legitimate historical Peter, I like to think it's this one. I like this Peter. Okay? This Peter very much resembles Peter at the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2 when he stands up and preaches, or the Peter who stands up to the Sanhedrin. But it's difficult to know how seriously to take these documents because they're agenda-driven. They want to show how Clement becomes Bishop of Rome. And so they link him to Peter is the way to do it. All right, the Acts of Peter in the second text. Here we see Peter as kind of a martyred worker of miracles. There's a whole lot going on, okay, in these documents. Late 2nd century AD. Okay, so this is a document that's very popular in the early church. And I should back up and mention that when we talk about the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Christian church, it's not as if there's one dominant kind of monolithic church entity. There's a number of traditions, there's a number of entities kind of competing for supremacy. And you see this as early as pastoral epistles. You read Paul in 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, and he's talking about all these crazy doctrines that people are teaching, and all these leaders that he has to excommunicate because they're doing such a bad job. And the apostasy happens quick and it happens fast, and it kind of leaves the church or the churches in a difficult position. There's no internet. There's no way to kind of streamline message. You can't send out an email. There's no correlation committee. Every church just kind of does the best that it can. But the way that the churches try to assert themselves is through the production of these texts. And the church we call the Catholic Church today is the church that emerges, kind of victorious from this, and takes all the other churches and kind of pushes them off to the side. And so these are theological weapons in the midst of a kind of a crisis that we're looking at here. So lots of legends, lots of myths. It's kind of a romance narrative. Lots of stories. The Acts of Peter is fun to read. There's talking dogs. There's people resurrected from the dead. Magical competitions. As I said, Peter runs into Simon again. It's a fun, entertaining story. But the author, once again, has an agenda. We don't know who the author is. I don't think it's Peter. I don't think it's connected with Peter. Because the author of the Acts of Peter is very concerned with the idea of celibacy. And so there's a number of stories throughout the Acts of Peter where this agenda, this aversion to sexuality really comes out. So for example, there's a story at the beginning about Peter's daughter. And we're told that Peter's daughter is crippled. And she's carried around next to Peter. Where Peter goes, his daughter goes. But the people are getting concerned because here's Peter doing all these miracles for other people, but he's not doing anything for his daughter. He's just kind of leaving his daughter there. And so they say, Peter, why don't you do something for your daughter? And so he goes over and he heals her. Okay, and all the people ooh and ah, and she walks and jumps around, and they're all excited. Then he makes her crippled again. Okay? And they're saying, okay, what's going on with Peter here? And he says, look, I did this for a reason. I had a vision back when my daughter was born, that someday she was going to grow up and she was going to run away with some guy. Some guy was going to take her and swoop her up and defile her. She was going to get married and have sex and have kids, and surely we didn't want anything to do with that. And so God, through me, made her crippled. So we wouldn't have to worry about her being appealing to me. Okay? And everyone says, wow, that's great wisdom. Okay? Same thing happens in the gardener's daughter. This is the tale that follows this, where Peter comes to a town and a gardener comes out and says, say a blessing on my daughter. Okay? Promise her something magnificent. So Peter lays his hands on her head and she dies. She falls over dead. And the gardener says, well, what are you doing? I didn't want her dead. And so Peter says, well, I gave her what you wanted. I gave her something remarkable and magnificent. And the gardener says, I want her back. And so Peter brings her back to life. And a week later, she runs away with someone in the gardener's house. And they go off and they live together. And the gardener comes back to Peter and says, now I understand why you killed her, to keep her from this fate. Okay? I wish I could go back and change my mind. Okay? So it's better to be dead, okay, than to be sexually active, okay, as far as this text is concerned. Very concerned with celibacy. Once again, if you read 1 Peter, this isn't essentially from Peter at all. It's kind of this dislike of the physical. And so it's very difficult to kind of correlate what you get in the Acts of Peter with what you get in the actual canonized documents. Okay? So once again, as I said, the centerpiece of this text is this encounter between Peter and Simon. O Lord, in thy power raise up through my voice the man whom Simon killed with his touch. As I mentioned, Simon is doing this kind of this one-upmanship, this magical competition. It's like right out of Harry Potter. Simon kills a guy, and Peter brings him back to life. Then Simon flies around, and Peter says this prayer, make haste, Lord, with thy grace. Let him fall from this height and be crippled, but not die. Let him be disabled and break his leg in 3 places. And then that's the sign. That's the sign to everyone that Peter must be a legitimate prophet, is because he has this power to bring Simon down out of the sky. Okay, once again, this just remarkable scene. Okay, is there any historical truth to it? I doubt it. Okay? But 2 characters from the Bible who had a previous encounter, Peter and Simon, get intertwined over the course of these narratives. Peter continues to kind of preach his message of celibacy while he's in Rome. And this, according to the Acts of Peter, is what gets him in trouble. This will eventually lead to Peter's death. He starts preaching to a bunch of concubines about celibacy, and they go home and they refuse to sleep with their husband. And then a very important Roman politician, Peter preaches and baptizes his wife, who refuses then to sleep with him. And so they get together and say, we've got to get rid of this guy Peter. He's causing us too much trouble. And so Peter hears about this and he flees. And then this kind of the famous story that emerges from this, as Peter's leaving Rome, he has a vision of Jesus. And he said, Lord, whither goest thou here? Very famous in Latin, quo vadis, going in. And the famous movie Hollywood in the 50s, quo vadis, right? Kind of tells the story about Christianity in the first century. And where are you going, Lord? And the Lord said to him, I am coming to Rome to be crucified. And Peter said to him, Lord, art thou being crucified again? He said unto him, Yes, Peter, I am being crucified again. And Peter came to himself. He saw the Lord ascending into heaven. Then he returned to Rome, rejoicing and giving praise to the Lord, because he said, I am being crucified, since this was to happen to Peter. And so the famous story of Peter being crucified in Rome, upside down, and it has its origins in this tradition. Now, we often talk about, well, Peter's crucified upside down as kind of a sign of humility, right? That he didn't want to die the same way that the Lord did. But that's not what the Acts of Peter says. The Acts of Peter actually says something very different. This is what Peter says as he's being crucified. He says, For the first man, whose likeness I have in my appearance, in falling head downwards, showed a manner of birth that was not so before. So what he's saying is, he's going to choose to be crucified upside down because that's how Adam came into the world. Just as the baby comes out of the mother's womb, head down, Peter is going to be crucified head down as well. As kind of an echo, kind of in honor of Adam. So that's the as close to historical reasons we can get to why Peter is crucified upside down. Okay? Take it for what it's worth. All right. So there's kind of Peter as this miracle worker, champion of the Orthodox faith. Other texts give us a different picture of Peter. So, for example, the Gospel of Thomas, a very early text, okay, that could be first century, at the very latest 2nd century AD. It's called the Gospel of Thomas, but it's attributed to Didymus Judas Thomas, who tradition says is the twin brother of Jesus Christ. Okay, so somebody who has a very close relationship with Jesus. It's actually 114 sayings of Jesus. It's not really a narrative. It's just a bunch of things that Jesus says, kind of words of wisdom, so to speak. And it's mildly Gnostic. Now, when we talk about Gnosticism, Gnostics were a group of Christians. It's an umbrella term, not to refer to a specific group, but a belief system in the 2nd and 3rd century. There were Christians who would argue that the physical world is evil. They're really kind of harkening back to Plato and that Greek worldview. And they would teach that secret knowledge is really what saves you. And if you understand that secret knowledge, you understand what it is and where you can find it, it frees your soul from your body and allows it to continue on its journey through the universe. Mormons historically have found a lot to like in Gnosticism, and there's a lot of similarities, kind of the emphasis on esoteric knowledge, the journey of the soul, and things like that. But there's also some not so amazing stuff that's a little bit difficult to deal with. But the Gospel of Thomas is a text that seems to kind of come from this camp, this way of thinking. And so what we have here, at the very end, we have kind of this encounter between Simon Peter and Mary. Okay, where Simon says to the 12, the apostles who are gathered, this is another one of those resurrection dialogues. And this was pretty common. When you wanted to claim you had secret knowledge, when you wanted to claim that you had the message of salvation, you would locate it in the post-resurrection ministry of Jesus. Because all we have is that reference in Acts 1:3 to a 40-day ministry. And it's a black hole in the scriptures. We don't know anything that was said during that time period. And it's 40 days. Jesus is here teaching for a while. And everyone wondered, well, what was said? Well, what did Jesus tell the apostles? Well, these texts would emerge to kind of fill in those gaps. And this is one of them that tries to say this is what Jesus taught during those 40 days. After Jesus' teaching, Simon Peter said to them, the other apostles, he says, "Let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life." And Jesus said, "I myself shall lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman who maketh herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven." Okay, a little bit strange there. But what we see is we see Peter being kind of slow to get on board with what Jesus is teaching. And kind of trying to exclude Mary, who's always there listening at the feet of Jesus. She's always quicker to understand than Peter is, and Peter seems to resent this. And so what you probably have is one of these Christian groups who see themselves on the outside are using Mary to kind of represent them, and Peter as representative of this kind of emerging Orthodox Catholic Church, saying what we have is secret knowledge of salvation, but it's being rejected, being repressed by Peter. Okay? And so you have a phrase like this. Okay? She may become, make her male. It's kind of weird. One of the things that the Gnostics did, what they believed in is they're trying to build or restore paradise, right? And so you go back to the beginning, you go back to the pre-fall state, and one of the common beliefs was that prior to the fall, there was just one being, just one human, male and female created through them. And it's as if they're somehow one. And the fall separates the two. And so in order to counteract the effects of the fall, you have to recombine them again. Mary must be made male. The female must unify with the male in order for her to be made whole. And Mary gets that, and Peter is just off in left field. He has no idea what's going on. And so this is a very unflattering depiction of Peter. You see something similar in the Gospel of Mary, okay, which is, once again, a very early document. It is very heavily Gnostic. Okay, there's no doubt here. Okay, and Peter comes across as just a hothead, just somebody who can't understand what's going on. He's, in the Gospels, you read the Gospels, and some of the Gospel authors portray Judas. He's always late. He's always the last one there. The Gospel of Mary, same thing with Peter. Okay, he's the guy who's always late. Did I miss anything when he comes in? He just doesn't seem to get with the program. And so what you have in the Gospel of Mary, a very short document, we're missing a large part of it, but Mary is recounting this amazing vision that she's had, where she's traveling through the heavens, okay, believed in 7 heavens. And so she's talking about going through each level to the top. Then there's this huge gap, this lacuna in the narrative where she talks about what she's learned. That part, just for whatever reason, has been taken out. I wish we had that part. I think that would tell us a lot. But when she's done telling the 12 what she's learned from this vision, Peter responds, did he, meaning Jesus, really speak with a woman without our knowledge? Would he have taken Mary on this journey through the heavens? Are we to turn about and all listen to her? Did he prefer her openly to us? Okay, so once again, you have Peter as representative of the Orthodox Catholic tradition, and then this group now personified as, again, Mary, getting brushed aside. And Mary gets very emotional. She responds with, do you think that I thought this up myself in my heart, or that I'm lying about the Savior? It's kind of this very poignant scene. And finally, Levi has had enough of Peter and says, Peter, you've always been hot-tempered. Now I see you contending against a woman like the adversaries. If the Savior made her worthy, who are you indeed to reject her? Surely the Savior knows her very well. That is why he loved her more than us. Okay? And so Peter says, okay, maybe you're right. Then kind of gets in line with Mary and Jesus, and the program goes out and does some missionary work. And that's kind of where the text ends. So you see Peter kind of being brought back into line by Mary. Once again, this kind of theological warfare going on in the midst of these texts. Another text, this one's known as the Apocrypha of James. Again, a slightly different side of Peter. Here we see Apocrypha simply just means of secret writing. So once again, it's another one of these post-resurrection 40-day ministry dialogues where Jesus comes down and has a special discussion with James and Peter. This is James, the brother of Jesus, the Bishop of Jerusalem. This is James, the brother of John. Tradition says James joins the church and becomes a very prominent figure after the resurrection. Okay? So he says, look, when I was here during mortal ministry, I taught everyone in parables. He says, now that I'm back, I'm going to give you the meat. I'm going to give you the good stuff. I'm going to tell you what's really important. Then begins this kind of lengthy dialogue to James and Peter. Once again, James probably representing one of these so-called heretical branches of the church. One of these ones who are kind of on the outside trying to work their way and gain some validity. Probably a Jewish Christian group because James was kind of their champion. Okay? And Peter representing the Orthodox Catholic Church. So you see, it begins with Peter saying, hey, I'm full. He says, I'm full. I've got all the knowledge I need. I learned everything I needed to during Jesus' ministry. But then Jesus says, well, hold on. James and you have not known me. Okay, there's things you still don't understand. And so there's this kind of Q&A between Jesus and James, where James seems to understand everything Jesus is saying. Jesus will say something, and James will say, that's interesting. That must mean this. And Jesus will say, yes. And Peter's just kind of hanging there in the background, not able to follow what's going on, still thinking that I've got everything I need. I don't really need to listen to this. And so finally, a frustrated Peter cries out, sometimes you urge us on to the kingdom of heaven, and then again you turn us back, Lord. Sometimes you persuade and draw us to the faith and promise us life, and then again you cast us forth from the kingdom of heaven. He feels like he's just getting torn back and forth by Jesus. And he says, I'm sick of this. I've had enough of this. Okay? Where James is just nodding his head as if he understands everything Jesus is saying. This is a much more subtle text. Because if you read it kind of just through quickly, well, here's Peter getting knowledge and James getting knowledge. So Peter seems to come off okay, chosen by the Lord. But when you look a little bit deeper, it's clear that there's once again an agenda here. Somebody who has a problem with Peter and what Peter represents and is trying to kind of tear down that image of Peter and lift up James and whatever group he represents in the process. Okay? So he's important enough to be present, but James is the one who truly understands, and it's James' questions that continue to prompt the discussion. So the last text we'll look at, this is what's known as the Gospel of Peter. Very, very short text. Also very, very early. At the latest, it's mid-2nd century. And there's a lot of people who actually think that this text, the Gospel of Peter, originally provided the accounts of the Passion that Mark and Matthew and Luke use. I don't know how much credence I would give that. But it is pretty early. There does seem to be some historical truth in this text, but there's also some issues. We have a letter written by a bishop of Antioch around 180 AD. He's named Serapion, and he's aware that the Gospel of Peter is being read in churches throughout the region. And initially he says, well, that's good. It's enlightening. There's some useful stuff. But then he hears that people are misinterpreting it. It's got some teachings in it that he has a problem with, and so he says, you know what? Everyone just stop reading the Gospel of Peter. Okay? And so it's kind of phased out at that point. But it is very agenda-driven, and it's very obvious as you read this text. It is very anti-Jewish. So, for example, it begins, we're missing a lot of the first part of it, and so we kind of jump in towards the end. But it begins with this scene between Herod and Pilate and the Jews, kind of discussing what they're going to do about the crucifixion. And it says, of the Jews, none washed his hands, neither Herod nor one of his judges. And since they did not desire to wash, Pilate stood up. And then Herod the king orders the Lord to be taken away, having said to them, what I ordered you to do, do. And so this document puts all the blame on Herod, who in the Passion narrative in the New Testament really doesn't do anything. He seems interested in Jesus. He wants to meet Jesus, but Jesus has nothing to say. He's the only person in the New Testament that talks to Jesus who Jesus has nothing to say in return. He just stands there silently. This document, however, wants to say the Jews are responsible. The Romans, we're going to make them exempt. And it's put all the responsibility on the Jews. And that's all the way through. The Jews are just clamoring for the death of Jesus, almost as if they know full well what they're doing. Okay? Peter, to this point, doesn't appear. There's no denial scene. And Peter is not mentioned in the narrative. Peter is not mentioned by name until you get to the very end. And it kind of closes with a couple of weird scenes. When it talks about the resurrection, right? Mary's at the tomb, or the centurions, the soldiers at the tomb. They see the stone's been moved to the side, and they see these two angelic beings go in. And then they see three people come out. One of whom is Jesus, whose head reaches all the way to the heavens. And then you have this really weird scene where the cross actually comes out of the tomb and walks out of the tomb. And then not only that, it talks. And so you have this scene, while they were relating what they had seen, again they see three males who have come out of the sepulchre, with the two supporting the other one, and a cross followed them. And obeisance was heard from the cross. The Lord speaks to the cross, and the cross answers yes. Okay? I don't know what you want to do with that story. Okay? But what matters for an understanding of Peter is the very last line. Up to this point, no indication of authorship. Peter hasn't appeared at all. But the very last line says, I, Simon Peter, and my brother Andrew, having taken our nets, went off to the sea. Okay, so here you have a text that seems to be a little bit outside Orthodox tradition, very agenda-driven, and all the author has to do is say, as attribute it to Simon Peter. Put his name there at the end and say, I, Simon Peter, wrote this, and that's enough to grant it enough validity, enough legitimacy for it to be read throughout the early Christian church. Just by mentioning his name, it gains validity. So Peter as a witness, just for Peter to say, and this is what I saw, matters. So what should we do with this? How should we interpret these events? Well, a couple of quotes. One by Tom Wayman, who's actually presenting down the hall right now, wrote a great article on this for the Sperry volume that came out a number of years ago. And I really like what he says here. He says, the modern academic mindset has led us to believe that all, or at least a significant part, of the Apocrypha was believed to be historically reliable, and that people generally approach them in antiquity as credible sources. I think that's very fair to say. These are clearly popular. People are clearly writing them down, recording them, passing them on, reading from them. But the early church never elevated the apocryphal text to a status similar or equal to the canonical text. It is safe to say, based on current research, that every apocryphal text that claims to preserve the teachings of a New Testament figure was forged. The same cannot be said of the canonical texts, which indicate that the early church was quite successful, and I think this is a great point, at separating the wheat from the chaff. Okay, so just because these documents were produced, they were attributed to Peter, they talked about Peter. Okay, the church was still, when it comes to canonization, when it comes to choosing what texts preserve truth and really mattered, they were able to see, okay, 1st and 2nd Peter There's truth and legitimacy there. These others, while fun, and some of them hang on longer than others, but eventually by the time we get to 27 texts, those ones have been pushed to the side. Then this is John Welch, and who, when the Gospel of Judas, if you may remember a number of years ago, the Gospel of Judas was discovered and made a big was a big event. It was a big deal in Christian circles because you had this really strange story about how Judas was the only one who understood Jesus, and the rest of the apostles just didn't get it. You see the same kind of thing, except Judas is now the champion. Well, Dr. Welch wrote a very nice article in BYU Studies about this. And he said, filling in the gaps in traditional biblical stories, elevating the interests of one early Christian community over the other, and uncovering New World secrets with the aim of enlarging the canonical corpus are all hallmarks of the disparate body of literature long referred to as the New Testament Apocrypha. But despite any good intentions, and I have no problem saying that, I have no problem saying that people who used the figure of Peter, the name of Peter, the events from Peter's life, did so with good intentions. I don't know if that's the case for all of them, but I would say that's probably the case for some of them. The apocryphal writings are generally wrong-headed and unreliable nonetheless. Okay? And so the question then becomes, what do we do with what we have here? With these texts that we've looked at, these different interpretations of Peter, it's very difficult to ascribe historicity to these, to look at this and say, let's construct a biography of Peter's later life, okay, from what we see in these texts. You know, we have accounts that yes, he was in Rome and that he died in Rome, okay, but what happens between Acts chapter 10 and him dying in Rome, we just don't know. And so that's why these documents are so tempting to try and figure that out. But I'll close with this one quote that I think really hits this well when it comes to our discussion of Peter in the apocryphal tradition. Okay? It says, all in all, it is interesting how few of the Petrine texts, like the Gospel of Peter, or the Apocalypse of Peter, or the Preaching of Peter, reveal much for Petrine memory. Yeah, there's very little historicity there, except for the fact of its importance. Okay, Peter clearly mattered. He mattered enough for people to write texts in his name, to write Gospels in his name, to have him interacting with Jesus and the other 12, and doing remarkable events. Clearly he mattered. He was clearly important. Okay, what we can say beyond that is difficult, okay, to really find any kernels of truth. But as I said, what we can say, and I think we can say this with a fair amount of certainty, is that Peter did matter. So, thank you very much. We have a few minutes left if anyone has any questions.
I have a question. You have a teacher with grade A, B, C, and D, and somebody just misses by one, so they get the D instead of the C, or the B and the A. Do we have any that are inside the scripture that just barely made it? Some of the books in the canonized scripture, like, whoa, that one just barely made it in. I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, in fact, 2 Peter is probably the one, ironically enough. Good discussion. In fact, most New Testament scholars today would say 2 Peter is probably in the 2nd century text. Others have barely made it, Hebrews and Revelation. The Western Church wanted Revelation, the Eastern Church wanted Hebrews, and so they kind of met in the middle and took them both. But when we look at early lists of New Testament documents, 2 Peter, 2nd, 3rd John, James, and Jude were also kind of on the fringes as well. They're not there in a lot of early lists, they are there in others. On the flip side, there's a number of texts that just barely missed out. For example, a text called the Shepherd of Hermas. Probably, it's a 2nd century text that appears in a lot of early canonical lists, but didn't make the cut. It's a very long, lengthy vision that a young man has. Very interesting, some cool stuff there. First Clement is there in a number of texts. The Apocalypse of Peter, actually, we talked about, pops up in a number of canonical lists as well. And so the ones there are some that barely made it in, and there's some that were barely. Thank you. Yeah.
Which are the scriptures of the Catholics that have the canonized? That they accept, that we consider apocryphal, that they have.
Oh, texts like just if you have a Bible, you would find a section we call the Apocrypha, which would be 1st and 2nd Maccabees, additions to Daniel, additions to Esther, additions to Jeremiah. You would have Susanna, you would have Judith, you would have Wisdom of Ben Sirach, you would have Wisdom of Solomon, a text like that. Yeah, so I think, 14 or 15 texts total. that they would consider part of the tradition that we just don't really see. There's historical value there. It's first Maccabees and second Maccabees where we get kind of the origins of Hanukkah and things like that. And so it's describing historical events, but there's not really a whole lot that's spiritual. In fact, you have a tale called Bel and the Dragon that talks about how there's this dragon, like right out of Lord of the Rings, that's flying around Babylon. And so Daniel, who's really the champion of the Apocrypha, he really comes out and does these amazing things, gets the dragon to eat all these cakes, and its stomach hursts and it dies, and he saves Babylon. Okay? My guess is that's probably one of the things, when the Lord said there's a lot that's in it that isn't true in relation to man, that's probably what he was talking
Which are the Peter Apocrypha?
about. I don't think they would consider any of them. None of these New Testament Apocrypha would be considered canon by really any church. With the exception perhaps of like the Ethiopic church or something like that. There's going to be some Christian branches who would perhaps see these, but as far as mainline churches, it's just not going to be part of the tradition.
Is that true also of the Old Testament? Just where you some in, some out?
Yeah, for sure. In fact, there's an entire, as I said, category called Old Testament pseudepigrapha, where you have texts like Life of Adam and Eve, or a number of apocalypses, a number of visions, a text called Jubilees that has some very interesting stuff. Lots of fun stuff, but they were considered fringe enough that they weren't considered for the canon. Probably just as many that were close but not in as there are that are in. Yeah.
In the 40-day literature, when he kind of briefly talked about that, Hugh Nibley, he described a lot about that in some of his books. And at certain times, he actually talks about a restoration being spoken of in certain texts that the church will kind of come back in that essence. And he uses the words that when Christ will come, he'll come with him who sent me. Is this anything that you find in any Gnostic kind of texts, a restoration type picture?
Perhaps, not very explicitly. It tends to be because there's nothing they really want to restore here. Jesus is going to give them the secret wisdom, they're going to learn it, and then their spirits are going to leave. They're going to go somewhere else. So they're not really interested in a restoration, per se. But I think Nibley is right on. In fact, if you cross-reference Acts 1:4 with D&C 95, you see a lot of the same language discussed when he's talking about going to Kirtland being endowed with power from on high. A lot of the same language from Acts 1:3 is there as well, the promises of the Father, for example. And so it seems pretty clear to me, at least, that what we're talking about is kind of temple stuff. What we would associate with the restored gospel is what's being passed on during that time period. But other than that, I can't really say. Yeah, please.
So how do these documents spread around, and do we have multiple examples, multiple samples? Like, can you locate them to a certain place or origin?
Yeah, in fact, most of them would, as you know, you kind of have these main centers of Christianity. So you would have a document associated with James, usually originated around Jerusalem. Documents associated with Thomas tend to originate around Syria. And so each kind of location has its own particular literature, its own particular champion, so to speak, the person that they really align themselves with. And then they tend to have adversaries as well. For example, Paul is hated by a lot of early Christian groups. And so Paul will kind of be a villain in some groups. Like Simon Magus is probably kind of code for Paul. This kind of debate between Peter and Paul happens. And so how would they spread around? Maybe they would spread around in a region, but there's not a whole lot, I think, of texts going one text going all over the place. They tend to be centered around a specific region with specific ideas. Just because to copy a document was expensive in the ancient world. And so to copy it and then to have someone deliver it to a number of different churches would be expensive. So they tend to be rather localized.
Are there apocrypha associated with all of the original 12, or is it just a few?
No, pretty much any member of the 12 is going to get their own kind of corpus, their own body of literature. There's an Apocalypse for everyone. There's an Acts for everyone. So Acts of Peter, Acts of Paul, Acts of John, Acts of Matthias, Acts of Andrew. Okay? So everyone's going to kind of have their own Acts. And then just even obscure figures, like I said, like Matthias, who's mentioned only once, that gets his own text, his own documents that talk about him. But once again, is it actually telling us about him? whereas the name Matthias being used as kind of a way of promoting a church's or a movement's agenda. So yeah, but everyone kind of has their own.
Two questions actually. With the discoveries of the Dead Sea Scrolls of Qumran, were there any apocryphal writings that received particular notice by them? I know that some of the texts were more frequently copied than others. Were there any apocryphal writings that appeared more frequently that gave scholars the cause for reviewing those writings?
Well, since Qumran, the community, you founded probably about 150, they're wiped out right around 70 AD, so that there's really, they don't have access to any New Testament texts per se. There are several Old Testament texts that are there. For example, First Enoch gets a lot of play in Qumran. Jubilees gets a lot of play. Jubilees gets a lot of play. All the Old Testament texts we would consider canon, with the exception of Esther, are there in Qumran. And so it's very clear that the canon is very fluid. There is no real black and white, these are in, these are out. But as far as New Testament texts, not in Qumran per se.
Okay. And then as a follow-up question, if a lot of these apocryphal writings of many of the other notable disciples of Christ are not necessarily accurate or representative of who they may have been, what sources do we use to learn about those disciples as they go out and they preach the word to, I guess, the rest of the world? So like Matthias, you mentioned, and some of the other disciples. The historical information that we have from them, is that simply sparse, or?
It is very sparse. There are some church historians. So for example, there's a guy writing into the 2nd century named Irenaeus who preserves some traditions. He considers himself a student of John. Okay? And so he tells us some stuff about John. Perhaps the most famous Christian historian, Eusebius, writing during the time of Constantine, writes a lengthy history of the church. And a lot of our traditions come from Eusebius. But once again, you're dealing with a guy who's writing around 325, 330, 300 years after the ministry of Jesus. So he's likely relying on texts we don't have, which could give them some validity. And he talks about some of the texts that we talked about. In fact, some of the texts we have are only preserved in fragment form in historians like Eusebius. And so that would be the places you want to go. But also remember that history in the ancient world is not a social science. It's going to be agenda-driven as well. Eusebius is going to have an agenda. He's going to want to promote Constantine and Christian church. So he's going to lift up the people, his heroes, and kind of distance himself from others as well. So take it with a grain of salt.
You said Eusebius and Irenaeus?
Irenaeus, yeah. Those would probably be your two best places as far as early Christian traditions. Thank you.
How's the book of Adam and Eve?
The Life of Adam and Eve?
Goes like that.
It's interesting stuff. There's a lot of, as I wouldn't consider it gospel truth. I wouldn't replace, the Book of Moses with it or something like that. But it's fun to kind of go through and see some of the different Jewish traditions and legends and things like that. Some of the differences as well as some of the similarities. It's fun stuff. Other questions? Yeah, please.
Do texts always agree that Peter died in Rome?
For the most part, yes. There's strong tradition that he spends most of his time in Antioch, but pretty much early on, especially Eusebius, the historian Eusebius, tells us Peter dies in Rome. So that is pretty strong. It's not set in stone because we just don't know how he gets there. We don't know why he's there to begin with. And it's very likely that the Roman Church may overemphasize some of those elements. I mean, Paul dying there wasn't enough, so they needed Peter as well. But that's probably one thing you can say is historical, is the death of Peter.
Given the fact that so many of these, the Gnostic apocryphal gospels are so antagonistic towards Peter, is this something that can be used as evidence that early Christians considered Peter to be the head of the church because they're kind of responding to this proto-Orthodox idea by attacking him, even though Paul is certainly going to be much more prolific and have much wider range of followers. Yet these Gnostic Gospels are attacking Peter in particular. Is that evidence that a historian can use to say early Christian communities must have seen Peter as being a type of the leader of the church.
Yeah, I would say so. I would say that what that tells us is that Peter was held up in high enough esteem for you to either align yourself with him or you align yourself against him.
So it's kind of a evidence proving the Catholic point, right? Can it be taken that way that he's leading it?
Yeah, I don't have a problem with that. I wouldn't have a problem with that part. You just don't see that type of mentality, either the strong alignment or the kind of the harsh treatment with any of the other apostles. Like with documents about John or about Paul. You just don't see that kind of attitude.
So the fact that there's such a dichotomy probably means that there is something there.
Yeah, I would say so. I'd say that's a fair point. Yeah, please.
So I visited the Basilica, St. Peter's Basilica. Does the church, does our church consider that in general? Maybe is there a place up here? Is that?
I would say that would probably be the best guess. As far as I know, we don't have any revelations.
Nobody has said.
But I mean, he's clearly out resurrected somewhere handing out keys. So he may have been there at one time. But he wouldn't be. I wouldn't go there looking for him. Yeah, please.
Where did we get the account of Peter being crucified upside down due to his humility? Is that from early Christian fathers, or is there other apocryphal texts that speak about?
I want to say that first pops up around the 8th or 9th century.
Okay.
It's late, and it's because the whole idea that he's crucified upside down because he wants to go out the same way as Adam, that doesn't really satisfy us very well. So we want it to be something. Humility makes more sense. That's a picture of Peter we can embrace. But yeah, that's very late.
So is there any reason why we think the Romans give you a choice of whether to be crucified?
Perhaps. I mean, the Romans enjoyed coming up with unique ways to crucify people. That was part of the fun for them. In fact, we're told that when they sacked Jerusalem, there's 5,000 crosses outside the walls, and there's all sorts of different positions, sideways, upside down, nails in different places. And so for Peter to say, I want to go out this way, upside down, they'd probably say, okay, sure, we'll go for it. Okay. All right, so it's 9:30, I suppose. So thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.